There's a lot of stuff you gotta
I know.
There's such a strong sense of when I became a managing editor at CNC I called in all the senior get your stories. Maybe it was inevitable that I would south. Find that out.
So,
no, we're great statisticians. Yeah, absolutely.
I wasn't uploaded. I followed. I'll make this start last week. Oh yeah, no, it was great. No, I had as much related morphine was so slow that I didn't know. Morphine. I know. Actually,
this is yes, how are you?
I made it into the nursing station. So the annual 3-year-long annual
by definition, she said it's going to I know that. I have all kinds of communication with your dad, but we're having lunch. I didn't know you were here.
Sheldon, how's it going?
Scotty's got me doing all this stuff. And then I come back to
That's a very nice one.
Chris enjoyed meeting you tremendously as well. We spoke with him about it. He was rushing away there. Fascinated by all your ideas and directions.
I feel all right. Yeah, I have.
Yeah, me too.
You can come too, huh?
Yeah, I'm taking there.
I know you are. How are you doing? You start threatening $100, you got it. Pretty well done.
It's all set. Wow. You skated down to Canada-U.S.
Yeah.
Hi, Carol. How are you?
Our energy project meeting is the 15th.
Hey, morning. How are you? Saw your piece in the. That's a hell of a standard. Morning. How are you, John?
No, I can understand.
Thank you.
Retain some of the finer points.
Yeah. But his greatest gift to the world.
Good morning, everybody. Please take your seats. There is an overflow room being set up on the 4th floor. It will have the camera feed, and you can see and listen to everything if you can't get a seat here. My name is David Viette. I'm the director of the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all today to this analysis of Canada's election earlier this week. It's also a delight to have such a full house, to have interest from the different media outlets that are here, and also a big hello to the folks outside the center who are watching this via the web. This session is being webcast, and it will be archived later for use in case you didn't get the answers to all the questions. It's a pleasure, too, to do this event again 18 months later with the Canadian-American Business Council. In July 2004, we looked at the last election results. Not quite as big a crowd. I think this is going to be very interesting today. For those of you out on the web and those of you here who don't know about the Wilson Center, it's the United States Memorial to the 28th President Woodrow Wilson. It was founded by an act of Congress in 1968, and about half of our support comes from the Congress. We try to bridge the scholarly worlds and the policy worlds to encourage debate on issues, and in my case, the Canada Institute, to bring some knowledge about Canada to Washington, some analysis about the bilateral relationship. We're getting off to a little late start. We're not going to read bios, but I'm going to turn the program over to my co-host, Randolph Dove, who is chairman of the Canadian-American Business Council.
Thank you, David, and welcome, and thank everybody for coming. This will certainly be a lively discussion this morning. On behalf of the Canadian-American Business Council, we would like to welcome everybody. And I'd like to recognize a couple of our board members who are here. Kelly Johnston of Campbell Soup, Karen Phillips of CN, Steve Holloway of the Inter-American Development Bank, and Andrew Shishko from the Canadian Embassy. As you may know, the Canadian-American Business Council is the premier voice of the Canadian-American business community here in Washington and in Canada. We have information outside on the organization and how to visit our website. For those tuning in over the web, the website is canambusco, CANAMBUSCO.org, and you can get the information there. One other note I'd like to make is to recognize and thank Murray Smith of the Alberta office of the Canadian Embassy. They hosted us up in Calgary a couple months ago at our annual awards luncheon. And Murray has been telling us that Alberta will take over the world, and I see that they have taken the first step by putting Albertan into the Prime Minister, as Prime Minister. Again, thank you for coming, and we'll turn it over to John Wright to kick things off.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Wright, the Senior Vice President of Ipsos Reid, which is the polling firm in Canada. And I'm delighted to be here. I don't know how auspicious it was, but on the same day that the Prime Minister-designate has his first press conference, Jerry Zucker takes over the Bay, Canada's longest-standing retail outlet. The problem with something like this morning for all of us who have been involved in watching or participating in this campaign is where to begin and end in 12 minutes. That's our task. I mean, you can go back to 1987 with the birth of the Reform Party, but in fact, you'd have to go a lot further back to look at the Reform elements. You'd go through to the marriage of the Reform and the previous Conservative Party so many months ago to the campaign itself, and then you'd be looking forward. A terrific introduction to the new government was witnessed yesterday in the Prime Minister-designate's press conference on Parliament Hill. So after having prepared the 25 PowerPoint slides, I said, forget it. I'm going to just go for the extemporaneous and be as organized as I can. I'll also assume that many of you know a lot about Canada, but some of you don't. And so I'm going to be a little more detailed in some of these things and leave it up to the elected members, the ambassadors, and the more seasoned campaign people to to talk about some of the other elements. Canada now has its second minority government in almost 18 months. What was striking the last time I was here was that people really didn't understand what a minority government was about. The first was led by Liberal leader Paul Martin, the second by now Conservative leader Stephen Harper. A minority is where no one party has a majority of seats in the Parliament, and simply put, the Conservatives have the most. They won 124 seats the other night, the Liberals 103, the Bloc Québécois from Quebec at 51, the NDP at 29, and there is one independent member in Quebec who is a shock jock from a radio station who was elected. That should be interesting. Voting. We are a balkanized nation. And have been for some time. It's emphasized by a domination of the Bloc Québécois in Quebec, the Conservatives in the West, the rural Ontario Conservative, and the Liberal urban centre vote across the country in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. The last campaign yielded a Liberal minority when approximately 6.5% of the people in Ontario and 4.5% of the people in Quebec, in fact, switched their vote the night before. Pollsters were deemed to be out by a long shot in the last campaign, and in fact there was some witness of it again this time when 4.5% of Quebecers stepped up to the plate, but only 4% of Ontarians switched their ballot at the last moment. You sort of say, well, is that a big number? Yes, it is, because in the province of Ontario there are 106 seats, and a 4% swing can yield 25 seats. So that small shift, and particularly in Ontario, is particularly important. The campaign itself, by the numbers, we looked at the polling numbers and really didn't see much of a change from the outset. Going into this campaign, about 35% believed that the Liberals deserved to be re-elected, and almost the same number, in fact, voted for them at the end of the campaign. But I would divide the campaign into three parts, and the participants probably see it a little bit differently, but I saw the first part is the early and absent war. The Conservatives dominated in a blitzkrieg of daily media events, Mr. Harper making statements almost every morning on a particular policy issue. Didn't matter whether it was the GST tax issue or whether it was working families or whatever it was well organized and well executed, with the Liberals not responding in the same way. And my perception, although John Duffy, who's here, might be able to answer it a little bit better, was that I think there was a perception that Mr. Harper and his colleagues, who in many ways self-destructed during the last campaign, might do so this campaign, so they were going to wait them out. I refer to it from time to time as kind of a rope-a-dope strategy and kind of letting them do it on the ropes. The second part of the campaign was actually following Boxing Day. The campaign was not dominated by any particular issue, although there was the whole sense of the Gomery Commission, which is a commission that was set up to investigate corrupt practices in the province of Quebec. And there is a report that was issued and another one to be issued, which vilified a number of members of the Liberal Party in the province of Quebec. But while that may have been the underpinning, there was no other key issue in the campaign until Boxing Day. A young woman in Toronto was killed, an innocent bystander, in a terrible shooting in downtown Toronto on Yonge Street involving some gang members. And Toronto this year has been plagued by some issues regarding that. And what it seemed to do was galvanize a whole lot of people, not only in Toronto but across the country, around the issue of crime. And we can substantiate it in the polling numbers because on the day, a few days following the shooting, there was a statement issued by the family, and then high school students went back to school, and that is where, in fact, we saw the numbers change. There's actually a point of departure on the polling nights where you start to see them slip down. So there was a piece there where, in fact, it became a character assessment as opposed to a ballot issue on an issue, and how the parties responded to it. So that was the second part. And the third part was really the last couple of weeks of the campaign, where there were a series of ads that were launched by the Liberals. There were a series of leaks which happened throughout the Liberal Party, and trying to deal with the criticism around that took off of the message from the Liberal Party. And in the final days of the campaign, in a rush to shore up Liberal support, which in fact did have an effect, Mr. Martin and his team persuaded about, as I said, 4.5% of Ontarians to come back on side and to shore up their support. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been looking at a majority. We would have been looking at a very healthy minority, and it was in fact reduced. Some observations. The ballot question, I think some people will say that for the Conservatives it was Stand Up for Canada, or for the Liberals it was Choose Your Canada, which was very similar to the last campaign. I suspect the ballot question was more fear versus loathing, fear of Stephen Harper versus loathing of the Liberals. And it was a choice between the two. And in fact, if there was any similarity between the last campaign and this campaign, former Prime Minister Joe Clark indicated that in the last campaign, as a Conservative, it would be better to vote for Mr. Martin because better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And so that's the kind of ballot question that was there. The second point of observation, the New Democratic Party's Jack Layton ran what I thought was a great campaign and became a Liberal alternative. The question now is, with the Liberals going through a leadership convention, having had Mr. Martin resign, whether or not, as they continue to go through their issues, and I'm reminded that it took the Conservative Party a decade or 13 years to recover after all of their fratricide and machinations, whether in fact it becomes an opportunity for Mr. Jack Layton, who was deemed to be in the debates the most likable guy. In fact, 48% of Canadians said that they'd most likely want to go and have a drink with him. Whether he supplants the Liberal centre ground. I'm not suggesting that we go back to where it was in England around the time of the 1917s or 18s when the Liberal Party collapsed into the Labour, but there is a possibility here that Jack Layton's NDP may in fact have more of a platform over the next period of time. The Conservatives ran a very disciplined campaign with a potent combination of Alliance and old guard progressive Conservative members, and I'll get to that more on that in a minute. And the Liberals, frankly, were ganged up on. I mean, it's kind of hard, and I feel sorry for my friend John Duffy to know that he's being beaten up by three on a 3-to-1 odd, but that's essentially what happens when you're into a debate, and it's pretty tough to deal with that. There were three areas to think about. First, Mr. Harper's media conference yesterday marked a new stamp on where I think the administration may be headed, but Mr. Kenney certainly has more information than I do. First of all, as contrast, Mr. Harper had his press conference in front of the House doors, in front of the doors of the House of Commons, which would have been contrasted with Mr. Martin, who always had kind of a National Press Gallery press conference. Number two was that his press conference yesterday was brisk and economical. He took 15 questions in 22 minutes. He was very direct, whereas Mr. Martin would have been pretty chummy. The third thing is the priorities. You could probably count on 5 fingers. The Accountability Act, the GST, daycare, and fiscal imbalance. It was clear messaging, whereas with Mr. Martin, having to deal with the Parliament that he had so many messages and so many priorities, it was hard to identify which one was actually important. Number 4 is that the Cabinet itself, and this is where he's going to have the most pressure because there have been a lot of people waiting from the West to get into Ottawa, and that's important, but there's a lot of pressure to make sure that the Cabinet is selected so that it doesn't alienate other parts of the country. On February 6th, the new Cabinet will be selected. There has been no indication of when the House is coming back, that I guess at this stage. But it's probably likely to be smaller and more efficient than more rambling and out there than what the Liberal organization was. The organization itself, the difference between the two administrations is that it would appear that the organization has embraced the previous Progressive Conservative organization and the Conservatives, Alliance, Reform people. We see people like Senator Hugh Siegel, who was Chief of Staff to Mr. Mulroney, Derek Burney, who was a former Ambassador to the United States and Chief of Staff to Mr. Mulroney, Senator Marjorie Le Breton, who was with Mr. Mulroney, who was on the bus, and we see all of the other operatives from the Conservatives and the Reform Alliance combination working with this administration, whereas Mr. Martin had, internecine warfare to deal with virtually every day from the Martinites versus the Chrétienites, and that was very difficult to deal with, so a more cohesive organization. 6 is an approach, a very decentralist approach, where he's indicated that he's going to deal with the fiscal imbalance and meet with the premiers, but we all know that it's like that's a very difficult issue to resolve with premiers. After you think you've got a resolution, they're always back for more money, so we'll see where that goes. But more importantly on the positioning for the United States, and then I'll finish off on this, is that Mr. Harper has been portrayed as a social conservative, and one of the things that I think he's going to do in the next short period of time, if not already, is to try and be a bit counterintuitive. Same-sex marriage is an issue which, in fact, became a defining mark for him. He made it very clear in a couple of ways. Just before the campaign started, I noted his style is that he had a press conference just at the outset of the campaign and deliberately walked back to the microphone to indicate that there would be a free vote on same-sex marriage. Deliberately walked back and said that there would be, got it out on the first day, dealt with it, and then yesterday in the press conference indicated that it was not a priority, but it is something that would happen. But he deliberately walked back to the microphone. Having said that, when one reflects on the U.S. ambassador's comments, Mr. Wilkins, over the last number of weeks, and also the previous ambassador, one has to, and how Mr. Harper is being portrayed as someone who supports the Bush administration and that he would have sent troops to Iraq. It is important to note that yesterday, after 21 and a half minutes worth of questions had been dealt with, he used the last minute to actually come back to the microphone again and indicate that he was not happy with the position of the ambassador on challenging Canada's right to sovereignty in the Arctic. I mean, it may be a small point, but the reality was that he clearly distinguished himself immediately and sent out a message which he actually ended by saying, I do not take my guidance from the ambassadors from the United States, I take it from the Canadian people. So you can see a counterintuitive approach to a number of these issues that we'll have to watch for going forward. It is to say that 87% of Canadians, in fact, like or love Americans. This august group here is a testimony to how much Canadians like coming to the United States and Americans like going to Canada. But only 23% of Canadians, in fact, respect the current administration in this country, and as a result, that's the sort of dynamic that you have to play into. And 74% of Canadians say that it was the right thing to stay out of Iraq, and as a result, we have put our troops into Afghanistan, of which we've had some injuries in the last week or so, and one may lose their life today or tomorrow. Mr. Harper came back to the podium yesterday, as I said, and deliberately said this. And so, I think that this is an important issue to be cognizant of, and especially if you are commenting on Canadian affairs. How long will the minority last? I'm going to finish up by saying this. I mean, common wisdom has said most minority governments last 18 months. I have a different theory, and I'd be interested in some other comments here, but I actually think that it's a longer horizon. The bigger issue in Canada is the Bloc Québécois. The bigger issue is Quebec. The bigger issue is that right now, when they move back to Ottawa, they have the funding available and the platform to send their troops into Quebec to bolster the Parti Québécois, who can defeat Jean Charest, who is the Premier of Quebec in 2008. My own hypothesis is that you want to stay in Ottawa and use that as a platform as long as you can. And secondly, you want to, once the Parti Québécois, if it is successful, it has indicated they will put yet another sovereignty question to the fore. The question is whether or not, in fact, the Conservatives become the Federalist defenders or whether or not they play another role in this. The question is whether or not there's an election at the end of that time frame, or, given the machinations with the Liberal leadership, of which there's at least 5 or 6 speculated candidates, you choose a moment of weakness and go to the people on a ballot question, and the Liberals can't recover from that. I just close by saying that I think it's going to be the approach between both of the administration in Washington and the administration in Ottawa more businesslike. It's going to have to be that way because Mr. Harper does have some risks of being portrayed as too close to the United States, and as a result, he'll have to be very careful about that. And secondly, it probably is the most adept organization right now with contacts into the administration. But we are also cognizant of the fact that there is a regime change coming in the United States through its duly elected process at some point where there will be another election. And whether he or she is a liberal Democrat or whether they're a Republican is yet to be seen. But that's something which the administration in Canada will also have to be sensitive to. So that's I think it's 12 and a half or 13 minutes at least on that one. And I'd like to turn it over then to the next speaker.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Jason Kenney. I'm a MP with the Conservative Party from Calgary, from the constituency next to Stephen Harper. I have not mentioned to him that I won a higher vote percentage than he did by 4 points. I've been in Parliament for 8 years, and since I was first elected a Reform Party member, which was the Western populist conservative sort of faction of Canadian conservatism that started in the late 80s, early 90s. I was very involved in the transformation of that into a slightly broader tent called the Canadian Alliance, and then, of course, we, under Stephen Harper's leadership, managed to finally succeed in bringing both principal wings of the Conservative movement in Canada together under the new Conservative Party 2 years ago, 18 months ago. As John mentioned, in the in the last election, we were still, a party that was only 4 or 5 months old and still very fresh and had deep divisions, and we managed to overcome those. We're delighted to see that. I played a role in the campaign, helping to manage our rapid response, so what we call our war room in Ottawa. And John and I were frequent, almost daily combatants on various panels, so it's good to be back with John again. I have to say, we Canadians are, you Americans who follow Canadian politics are used to Canadian political figures demonizing, demagoguing about American politicians and political trends. We're always flattered when the reverse happens, so I was delighted to see former Vice President Gore weighing in with his prescient commentary on the Canadian election in front of an informed audience of bilateral experts at the Sundance Film Festival, where he told the assembled indie film producers from Hollywood that Stephen Harper's victory represented the secret agenda of the oil sands companies in Alberta who financed his campaign in order to exploit the oil sands. Shame. We're just for the record here in Washington, there's a multi-partisan consensus in favor of oil sand exploitation. Is that right, John?
That's fair to say.
Yes. And there's also a $1,000 limit of what companies can give to political parties. And just Mr. Gore might also be interested to know that most of the presidents of the big oil companies up there tend to be very loyal liberal fundraisers. So anyway, it's nice to see in reverse the kind of commentary that too often comes from the north directed to the south. But let me just, I don't want to be redundant from what John said. Just from our perspective, I'll just give you a sense of what we saw as kind of the deep background of this campaign. A government that is in place after 12 years, obviously fatigue building up over inevitable mistakes that it's made. However, a government that's presided over a growing economy, an economy whose growth parenthetically is principally fueled by exports to the United States, which was really catalyzed by the FTA and the NAFTA, and of course by until recently a relatively low currency. But that growing economy, while really has been the principal electoral strength of the Liberal Party over the past 12 years, and was most clearly associated with Mr. Martin and his competent fiscal management through the 1990s. But it wasn't exactly a red-hot economy that was delivering significant, tangible economic benefits to people. It delivered a sense of general confidence in the economy for the key swing electorate in Canada, which is middle-class suburban Ontarians. But there was a lack of real clear deliverables in terms of a lack of actual after-tax income growth over the past decade, declining productivity, a growing loss in increasing loss of manufacturing jobs to overseas. And so some minor economic anxiety was starting to set in, which I think was equally problematic for the government. But the real driving question that really helped us to define our ballot question was the question of accountability, which is the flip side of corruption. Mr. Martin inherited a government that had, whose predecessor had created a series of programs that some of which were wildly mismanaged, some of which involved criminality, which led to a expansive judicial inquiry, and there were findings about an elaborate kickback scheme, and this was really completely devastating to the Liberal Party, particularly in the province of Quebec. This is a story that's unfolded over the course of 2 years, but was really preceded by a lot of other smaller scandal stories. And so altogether, these scandals created deep and growing cynicism and fatigue with the administration in Ottawa. And try as he might, Mr. Martin wasn't able to shake public anger about this and the public cynicism, particularly in Quebec. He made various efforts, launched before the last election, rather, what was euphemistically referred to as his Mad as Hell tour. He was mad about Liberal corruption, and he was going to, come hell or high water, put an end to it. And that his narrative, his storyline on this just didn't quite have the ring of truth for the mean voter, because people said, well, just a minute, Mr. Martin, you claim to have been responsible for all the great achievements of the Chrétien government. You were there at his right hand. You were the finance minister. You claimed full responsibility for management of public finances in that period. And you're now telling us that you just always happened to be in the other room when the loot was being divvied up in these scandals. And nobody's ever suggested that Paul Martin, and I'm not here, of course, suggesting that he was in any way directly involved, but the notion that he was completely ignorant of what was going on in his own political backyard in Quebec, in the Liberal Party, which large chunks of which he controlled through his shadow leadership organization, was intuitively to most voters, particularly those in Quebec, just a little bit difficult to swallow. So he had a continual credibility problem on that, which he just couldn't shake. So those are some of the big background issues. And then John also mentioned an issue which is also resonates with the kind of conservative core policy in Canada, which is criminal justice. We've been beating our drum for a long time about what we regard as a criminal justice sentencing policy, which is soft on crime. That issue for us never really seemed to gain traction out of people who are already core conservative voters until this year, where there have been something like 75 firearm murders in the Greater Toronto area alone, growing number of gun murders in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, another swing electoral area. And as John mentioned, this was really galvanized with a horrific shooting right in the heart of Toronto in the middle of the day on Boxing Day, which was deeply resonant. So going into this election, the frame was for us that we had clearly the Liberals on the defensive in terms of accountability and corruption. Mr. Martin's credibility had been damaged in terms of his sometimes frenetic response to that. The crime issue was lining up with voters taking more serious account of the crime issue. And in terms of the strategic background, we had a Liberal Party which had a hard time healing some pretty difficult internal divisions coming out of a several-year-long internal civil war, but a Conservative Party which had really developed a discipline of power, had really become hungry to win, and which was willing to put aside our internal differences, which had become quite bitter over the past decade of division in the Conservative movement in Canada. So we had these different internal dynamics, and you could see these play themselves out during the campaign. We decided to craft a campaign rather than focus. We believed at the beginning of the campaign that the electorate was already sold on the premise that the Liberals were tainted, ethically tainted, and that Ottawa needed to be cleaned up, and that somebody else had to do the cleaning up. We thought that premise was already broadly accepted, and that was reflected in what John referred to. The change number was pretty consistently 55 and then up to 65% in favor of change of government. What we had to do was to set out and prove to swing voters that we constituted acceptable change, that weren't going to threaten, but in fact weren't going to threaten economic or political stability, but to the contrary, would actually deliver what the Liberals hadn't succeeded in doing, some direct, tangible, concrete, visible economic benefits. So we designed a very targeted platform focused on key profiles within the electorate, and went about day after day after day announcing micro policies. We did it early in the morning. We set the agenda. We owned the news cycle. We did this when the election was called all the way up into Christmas. Mr. Harper was the only leader to campaign more or less full-time between Christmas and New Year. In the meantime, our colleagues on the Liberal side seemed, as John said, to be waiting till the real. They seemed to dismiss all of that as the phony war. We didn't see any immediate movement in the polls. On the top line ballot, on the who are you going to vote for number in those first 3 or 4 weeks of the campaign. But we saw a steady clear increase in all of the underlying numbers: trust in Mr. Harper, desire for change, confidence in the Conservative Party as an economic manager, identification with us on the crime issue, identification with us on accountability. All the underlying numbers were moving in our direction in the first 3 to 4 weeks of the campaign. And then in between Christmas and New Year's, there were a series of serious problems that the Liberals encountered, some internal gaffes, and then the RCMP announced a criminal investigation into what I believe is another probable scandal, which was really the last straw for a lot of voters. It finally reminded them and confirmed their suspicions that there was something. There was this line of ours that there's a culture of entitlement in the Liberal government was ringing true, and that started to move the top line ballot number in our favor. We started to move up in the leads in the first polls at the beginning of January. We continued in a very disciplined way to lay out our program. We laid out a deliberate script throughout the campaign. And quite frankly, I was surprised with our success in day after day managing to get our intended message out through the earned media. Often that's been a problem for us in the past because of our own errors or because the other guys have been more successful in setting the agenda. But because we were very deliberate, very, very focused, everything Mr. Harper said went through about 8 levels of checks. We had, there was no fly by the seat of your pants stuff. When the Liberals came out with policy, major policy announcements that we weren't expecting, like a quote unquote ban on handguns, we immediately, we had a very controlled response rather than freelancing. We made sure our candidates provided a controlled response. So that was a kind of culture of discipline within our campaign. Ultimately, we also had the debates, of course, where I would say in the last 3 weeks of the campaign, particularly in the debates and onward, Mr. Martin appeared increasingly almost frenetic to the last week, where I would say he appeared to a lot of voters as being almost hysterical as he was ramping up a kind of fear campaign. And really, the final, the key thing for us was that when we were waiting for the Liberals to launch the fear campaign on Mr. Harper. And we thought it would be devastating. When we first saw, for instance, the ads they designed in this respect, we were very concerned. But let me just read for you a couple of the texts of the ads, and you'll get a flavor of what the back. I wish I could play a tape, but they had a beautiful martial drum roll in the background, undoubtedly a U.S. Marine band or something. Menacing music and a frenetic typewriter script came across the screen. Who paid for Stephen Harper's rise to the head of the party? We don't know. He refuses to reveal his donors. What do you suppose he's hiding? We do know he's very popular with right-wingers in the U.S. They have money. Maybe they helped. We just don't know. He won't say. Choose your Canada. And then I see Patrick Basham is here, I think. He was a target of one of these ads. This is from the Washington Times on Canada may elect the most pro-American leader in the Western world. Harper is pro-Iraq war, anti-Kyoto, and socially conservative. Bush's best friend is the poster boy for his ideal foreign leader. A Harper victory will put a smile on George W. Bush's face. Well, at least someone will be happy, eh? Choose your Canada. That's the tone of what was increasingly a point of emphasis in the Liberal campaign that was really playing on, I would suggest, the basest kind of Canadian tradition of anti-Americanism. But really where they went, I'll stop with this, where they really went over the top and destroyed their credibility on what was their plan B, the destruction of Mr. Harper's credibility, was on an ad that they approved, put on their website, didn't actually get aired, but it was aired more often than the Willie Horton ad was in terms of earned media here in 1988. It said, Stephen Harper actually announced he wants to increase military presence in our cities, Canadian cities. Soldiers with guns in our cities, in Canada. We did not make this up. Choose your Canada. This was ostensibly about a policy we had to increase some reserves in cities for natural disasters. Everybody understood it to be an implication that we would create a police state, martial law, fill in the blanks. And with this ad and the kind of increasingly over-the-top language that Mr. Martin was using, I think they lost their chance to turn the thing around. Anyway, I can do a little bit more of this with questions. I know we're running over time, but sorry to lay that on you, John. I'm sure you'll take no ownership for those ads.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And c'est un grand plaisir d'être ici à Washington aujourd'hui. I guess when I explained to my wife what I'd be doing today, because we're on our way to a well-deserved family vacation, Jason doesn't get these privileges because he gets to toil in the vineyards of the people. I said, look, I've been invited to this terrific conference. She said, well, what are you doing there? I said, well, I get the sense it's like one of those discussions, those symposia they used to have at West Point after the Civil War was over. She said, oh, well, that sounds kind of pleasant. I said, well, yeah, but I'm the Confederate. Let me just say that being here in Washington, I know that my next stop is before departing to meet my family in Point South, is to go by the Lincoln Memorial, which I try to do every time I'm here in town. And I think the words about from the second inaugural address, with malice towards none, with charity towards all, will take a new and consoling meaning in my life on this day. It really is nice to be here, and I guess I feel like I'm suddenly back in the thick of it with Jason. But stepping back maybe a bit to provide a bit of my perspective, I think there's three things I want to talk to you about very briefly. But before going into the substance, I should make it clear that I'm really speaking here as a private citizen. I'm not a Liberal Party official. I work, my day job is I'm a government relations consultant in Ottawa and Toronto, and I took a leave of absence to work on the Liberal campaign, but I'm no longer doing that, so I'm not speaking for the party. I don't have an official role in the Liberal Party. And now that outgoing Prime Minister Martin has made clear his intention to exit politics, I'm not speaking for a Martinite campaign because there isn't one anymore. So I'm really here as a private citizen, an amateur historian, and at your disposal. There are three things I want to reflect upon with you, and obviously looking forward to Q&A. A little bit on the hurly-burly here of how the campaign unfolded. My own sense of this Parliament, which is a unique Parliament in Canadian history, and one that I believe is of moment to all of you as you consider how to think through what's coming in Canada. And then a couple of notes about the future of the Liberal Party, which is obviously an unfolding drama as we speak. I think for us, I won't argue with the basic frame of the campaign. I think it was fairly clear. In the first part of the campaign, while Jason and his compatriots were successfully laying down these coalition assembling policies, our sense of what they were doing was that they were projecting above all, that all those pieces amounted to a kind of collage effect that created the impression, if you stood back, of Mr. Harper as a very reasonable, policy-oriented kind of guy who's doing just, good things for folks. We understood that to be underway, but I want to make clear that on our side of the hill, we never saw that as a phony war. What we were busy doing was seeking through positive advertising and through positive earned media messaging to reconnect something that had been frayed. And Jason spoke about the obverse side of it. The economic success story of Canada, which is as I'm sure you're tired of hearing Canadians advertised as unparalleled in the G8, there were some difficulties with that translating into a growth in real disposable incomes. That was a openness that created an opportunity for the Conservative Party. We sought to close up that exposure by reminding people of the economic success and trying to reconnect that with Liberal government and with the figure of the Prime Minister. We didn't succeed at reconnecting that during that first pre-Christmas frame to the same extent that Jason and his compatriots succeeded at creating the image of Mr. Harper as a moderate policy-oriented guy. So if there's any myth that somehow we were all behind some Maginot Line drinking the Margaux and waiting for the tanks to come blasting through the Ardennes one morning, I want to dispel that. We were very much engaged in a positive campaign. The Conservatives, just before Christmas, started to roll out their negative advertising on the Prime Minister. And obviously, negative advertising is no longer, I think, a taboo in Canada. It's proven to be very effective, indeed, I believe, domineeringly effective in the last two campaigns. I think we've substantially moved towards that world, which is familiar to all of you in the United States, for better and for worse. As we all know from the theory of this, nothing moves numbers, nothing moves vote intention so much as when you have both your advertising and what's going on out there in the real world of earned media working for you. So the Conservatives over Christmas had not only their attack ads going about alleged Liberal corruption, but this extraordinary event occurred, and it's been alluded to. I just want to spell out the facts. There have been some question and allegations from the opposition in the immediate scenario leading up to the fall of the government on November 28th that an announcement with regard to tax policy on the variable taxation of income trusts as opposed to normal share capital corporations had been leaked and had caused a run-up in the stock market among those who had been inside on the leak. And there were questions raised. The media did a lot of probing. There's nothing proven out on the table, but the questions kept mounting. On the 28th of December, I won't forget this, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I got a note from our media people that simply said, "Whoa." And attached to it was a news release from a New Democratic Party member of Parliament who had been worrying this issue like a bone, that said, I have a letter here from the RCMP stating that while there is no evidence of any specific wrongdoing, they are going to take an investigation and move it forward, and that is a criminal investigation. So right there, kaboom. You've got the top story happening for days that the finance minister is effectively, and there's some sort of elision that happens here in a campaign, is effectively under criminal investigation. The finance minister was under pressure to resign from opposition people and from media. The prime minister stood by him, being absolutely convinced that Minister Goodale's 30-year record of unchallenged integrity would see him in good stead. But at that point, you saw the numbers start to move immediately because you had the earned media frame and the paid media frame for the Conservatives moving in close order and very effectively. That made it impossible for us to succeed in our positive policy offensive, which we rolled out in the first week of January. We had some very carefully nurtured, carefully costed, carefully thought through, and widely consulted programs ready to go. We had planned for some time to roll them out in the immediate first week of the new year. Their offensive power was absolutely nullified by not only the repeated questioning that the Prime Minister had to take about this alleged scandal, but also by executional errors, leaks that caused our platform announcements to be known the night before, with predictably adverse results for our media relations. It was a week when, simply put, our offensive power could not get traction. And as a result, we wasted, in effect, months and months and months of policy work without moving the numbers at all. In fact, we continued to go down. In the final phase of the campaign, as we had always planned, we moved with our very pointed criticisms in advertising and on the stump of Mr. Harper and his agenda. We raised questions that we believed needed to be raised. And we were able, I guess the best line on the Liberal campaign goes to a journalist from Edmonton named, I think he's from Edmonton, Colby Kosh, who said that the Liberals were able in the final part of the campaign to snatch defeat from the jaws of decimation. That will have to be the Spotsylvania courthouse battle of those of us who are puttering around West Point in the prisoner's docket for the rest of our lives. My own sense of this Parliament going forward, and by the way, the campaign ended for us on a note of real pride, I think, because the Prime Minister did a very classy thing in this extremely complicated parliamentary situation. He did have an option to try to hold on to power without having a plurality of either the popular vote or Parliament, and I'll explain that in a moment, our parliamentary seats, but he chose not to do that. It wasn't really an option for him in his own mind, even as the numbers unfolded, and he had always said whoever gets the most seats wins. And so he surprised a lot of people who I think underestimated his integrity about this sort of thing by announcing right there on the spot in Montreal at a moment I won't soon forget that he would be not leading the party in the next election and exiting politics after a time. And that was universally regarded as a very classy exit and the right thing to do for the sake of the Liberal Party, and I was very glad that he did it. My own sense of this Parliament is that it is a unique Parliament in Canadian history. It is, in my mind, the most unstable. If you look at the numbers, you have never seen a Canadian Parliament in which the governing party has 2 seats to 3 for the opposition. Those are the numbers. So 60% of the parliamentary seats are in the hands of opposition parties. Now, that normally isn't a problem, except all of those parties, each of those parties, is a centre-left party. The Bloc Québécois represents la tendance social-démocrate in Quebec, their social democratic tradition, which is much more Western European than North American, I think it's fair to say. The NDP is obviously the social democrat English-Canadian fact, and the Liberal Party, which is traditionally in the balanced middle, has, I think it's fair to say, been a bit further to the left in its campaign positioning than it might have been in some other campaigns. There are no natural allies for this government, and in fact, this government is in direct competition for votes with all 3 parties. Stepping back a little further, I think it's fair to say that in effect, Parliament represents what one friend of mine referred to as the 3 solitudes. And the issue of whether they can dialogue effectively in Parliament is really an open question. You have on the one hand the Conservatives, which dominate in rural and resource-based Canada, what one former Conservative member once called Outer Canada. You have the Liberals and the NDP splitting on a 3-to-1 basis the plurality of voters that are in what this same fellow called Inner Canada. That is to say, the major population centers, the big 3 conurbations. And you have the third solitude, which is French Quebec, which is still in parliamentary terms dominated by the Bloc Québécois, although, to their very great credit, the Conservatives were able to smash through in Quebec outside of Montreal among Francophone ridings and supplant the Liberals as the first choice for Federalist voters. Which is the most important thing that happened in this election by far. But right now in Parliament, in effect, you have 3 different tendencies represented in 3 different voter bases represented in a very pure form. We haven't seen this since the 1920s, which were the most unstable period in Canadian politics. And in fact, the proportions as between them are even more wobbly in terms of putting together a dialogue and a working governance structure than they were in the 1920s. The phrase pizza parliament, a way of saying that this is pretty Western European, is one you're hearing a lot more of. Just to conclude on the future of the Liberal Party, we will be having a leadership race that will be happening. I was just talking, in fact, to the president of our party this morning. It's certainly his view that our Constitution is clear on this. We are scheduled for a biennial convention sometime in a window that ends around next March. A quick race could be held by September. I think the sense of the party is that they'd like it to be sometime between November and March. As for policy direction, the Liberal Party needs renewal. Liberals want a big, wide-open race with lots of candidates and a lot of debate. And you'll be seeing more about that going forward. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Andrew for the very big picture.
Thank you very much. My name is Andrew Cohn, and I come to you not as a pollster or as a politician or as a partisan, as the 3 other speakers all are, but as an observer. It is a pleasure to be here. My thanks to David Bayet, who does great work here in bringing Canada to life and to mention and note in this city. Only he could bring John Duffy and Jason Kenney together. I feel like this is the Al Smith dinner of Canadian politics. They still have that dinner? A few words. I'll step back and look at it, I think, a little bit differently. Then I'm going to leave Canadian-American relations to Ambassador Giffen, but I will say some, after looking at the election, a few words just on foreign policy under the new Conservative government. My sense is this campaign, which people profess not to want, was kind of like the pushy cousin who comes at Advent, or your American Thanksgiving, and stays through Christmas, New Year's, and Epiphany. It was the campaign that seemed to go on forever. Experts sniffed that it would be shallow, predictable, nasty, and inconsequential. Actually, it turned out to be substantive, surprising, relatively civil, if uninspiring, and most important for the electors of Canada, decisive. Maclean's, in a very long special edition, running a cover story that goes about 25,000 words, actually called it the most decisive election in a generation. How decisive, who knows? But indeed, if it does turn out to be a realignment of priorities and politics, and you could say that an ambitious government with a hidden agenda or even a not-so-hidden agenda could make it so, I don't think it was because the parties promised a sea change or the people demanded it. My sense is fundamentally Canadians wanted a change of leadership more than a change of policy, and they wondered how to do it. They disliked the choice between the ethics of one party and perhaps the ideas of another. And like the classically conflicted Quebecer who wants an independent Quebec in a united Canada, I suspected Canadians wanted liberalism without liberals, or ultimately conservatives without conservatism. Changing while staying the same is a thoroughly Canadian thing. Historically, whether voting Liberal or Conservatives, Canadians like their governments as radically moderate as they are. They also want competence, consistency, and integrity, and as long as their government is a trusted, prudent conciliator between French and English, governments can lean to the left or the right modestly. The extremes of Canada are its weather, not its politics. Canadians are inclined, as my friend John Duffy, who wrote a superb book on Canadian elections, and maybe he'll write another one on this campaign, but as he knows, I think Canadians are inclined to re-elect and keep around moderate governments, whether they are Conservatives in Alberta, who've been around forever, or New Democrats in Saskatchewan, or Liberals in Ottawa, who, as you know, have governed for most of Canada's history. However, when Canadians lose faith in a government, as they did in Louis Saint Laurent's government in 1957, or John Diefenbaker's in 1962, or Joe Clark's in 1979, they push it aside. When they get angry, as they did with the Liberals in 1984 or the Conservatives in 1993, they sweep it away. We should recall in looking at this campaign that when the election was called in November, the day after Paul Martin's government of 17 months fell on a vote of non-confidence, that in fact the Liberals, as we saw, were ahead. And how the Conservatives reversed their fortunes is, of course, the story of those last 8 weeks. It was the story of how a party born of the Canadian Alliance, as Jason has said, and the Progressive Conservatives, softened its edges, drove to the centre, and won credibility as a government in making. And most dramatically, I think, it's a story of the remaking of Stephen Harper. From the beginning, as the Conservatives cast it, the campaign was about change, 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 modest change, and it was a theme they sounded. It wasn't a tough sell, given that the Liberals, who had been in power since 1993, were seeking something unusual, a 5th consecutive mandate. And if my math is right, John can correct me, but I think only twice in Canadian history has that happened. So historically, the forces were against the Liberals in getting that 5th consecutive mandate. It also helped, as we've heard, the Liberals were seen as tired and unimaginative, and the view that was accentuated when the RCMP announced that investigation. I don't think there's been enough, frankly, honest, independent reporting about that investigation and what the RCMP was up to. There are many people, by the way, they're probably not in Jason's party, who think the RCMP has done some very odd things in Canada and maybe something of a rogue elephant. But that we'll find out more about them in the future. But the desirability of change, the necessity of change, that was the ballot question of 2006. And as its siren song settled on the national consciousness, it reached its tipping point around Christmas, and so did Stephen Harper as the agent of that change. Now, once again, Mr. Harper. You know, you look at Mr. Harper and I think of him as newly coiffed. He has a new haircut, newly clad, he has new clothes, and newly coined. He was the star of the campaign. Tieless and turtlenecked, he uttered sweet assurances that he was no longer the arrogant, angry ideologue from Alberta. He did this with a much more engaging smile. Something happened to that smile, Jason, in the campaign. It used to be a half smile. It became a full smile in the campaign. And I don't know if the same person who worked on George Bush's smirk worked on Stephen Harper's half smile, because it was remarkable.
There's an ad in there somewhere.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're working on it. It may have worked. A headline, "Harper growing on us," said one newspaper in the last 10 days of the campaign, and perhaps that was true. He no longer seemed to have to Canadians hoofs, hooves, and a tail. And whatever Mr. Martin's attempt to paint him as surly and the resentful Cassandra building firewalls, his term, that is Mr. Harper's term, around Alberta, and lamenting the second-rate dominion of socialism and its culture of defeatism, that didn't seem to gain traction with Canadians. Mr. Harper did this by managing a disciplined textbook campaign, learning from his mistakes. People have always underestimated what political leaders learn in a campaign, silencing his plain-speaking candidates. It was what a feat that was. I mean, in 1992, Bill Clinton ran worried about bimbo eruptions and what former lover would emerge and throw his whole campaign into jeopardy. The Conservatives worried about Yahoo eruptions, and there were none, even if it meant muzzling and bundling people into straitjackets. There was one day the media actually reported this. They couldn't get near local candidates and good for the Conservatives. I mean, these people were told, don't say anything, don't take us off message. Extraordinary discipline there. And that helped Stephen Harper, that discipline campaign, deflect allegations that he may well be the most conservative and most devolutionist prime minister we've elected. It also made the campaign largely about issues, childcare, healthcare, tax relief, gun control, which were addressed in leaders' debates, which I think were much better than they were in 2004. I think most people think that. And as the Conservatives made Mr. Harper presentable, they made him look more bland. So cautious were they in his packaging that he was the only one of the leaders who refused to tell Time magazine his favorite book or movie, apparently terrified that a secret passion for, say, Cheaper by the Dozen or King Kong would kill his chances of being Prime Minister. In the same way, I got the sense that the Tory platform could have been written in the Prime Minister's office. Peter Newman, who I think is the best journalist of his generation, said looking at the differences between the Conservative and the Liberal platforms was kind of looking for the differences in synchronized swimming. I wish it were my line, but it's his. And then if there were great ideas, they were put under house arrest. In 1911 and 1988, politicians talked about free trade. In 1917, they talked about conscription. In 1979, the Constitution. In 1958, John Diefenbaker trumpeted a Northern Vision. In 1968, Pierre Trudeau, the Just Society. But from Stephen Harper, an economist and an industrialist, there were no big dreams or sweeping visions, no poetry, just subsidized bus passes, beer and popcorn, and some jousting over who loved Canada more. But Mr. Martin could, like Pierre Trudeau in 1972, say the land was strong, and he did. Economic management was his calling card, and along with differences in his values and Mr. Harper's, he attempted to become in the last week, and I think that people may criticize the last week, but it's there that probably he saved the Liberals from that decimation. He became Captain Canada, the defender of the Charter of Rights, the savior of Medicare, and the Kyoto Accord. With that mix of nationalism, centrism, some would say anti-Americanism and demonization. Mr. Martin, I think, had to draw the distinction between the Liberals and the Conservatives, at least in style, because in substance, and I think people felt they were alike. A lot of people, I think, looked at some of the, if you look at whose waiting list, hospital waiting list is shorter, or whose tax cut was deeper, are these really issues that are going to matter in the next 5 years? I saw this being remarkable, this winter of our contentment. I know that Jason and John have talked about perhaps some unease over the economy, but I think the larger story is that both acknowledge is the economy is the best in a generation. And yes, there is anxiety among auto workers in Oshawa, but there are also jobs being created in the auto industry in Alliston, Ontario. More Canadians are working, more are buying houses. This is Canada's summer in many ways. That separatism is stirring, or smog is advancing on Toronto, or immigrants are struggling, or Arctic ice is melting, or Canadian immigrants are trying to succeed, or the rural-urban divide is deepening. Those issues weren't part of the campaign, and nor was the world. Darfur, AIDS, terrorism. In Sleepy Contented Canada, we were discussing lower taxes and child credits. Just a modest comparison. I was here as a former Washington correspondent for the Globe and Mail. I was here in 2000 covering the election between George Bush and Al Gore. And they're not huge similarities, but you do have a Western conservative with limited experience outside politics, riding into town, offering to clean things up. I don't think it mattered to Americans that year, the differences between the two parties. So great was their prosperity, their detachment, and it became known in some circles as a Seinfeld election, the election that didn't have an overriding issue. Stephen Harper is no George Bush, but I think there was something of that sentiment in a vacuum in Canadian politics. how did it all turn out? I think very much a reflection of the Canadian character in what happened. I think Canadians largely got what they wanted. There was a prudence here, a caution, a care, a moderation, conservatism with a small c in a sense, or a big C, depending on how you look at it. Canadians first elect a conservative government. They change the government, but they don't give it a majority, as we see. And in fact, they give it, as John has said, fewer seats than the Liberals had. But they do give it 10 seats in Quebec. And as a result, we dodged the bullet of a Western party elected in Canada without any representation from Quebec. And if you're a Federalist, you have to cheer at that. That is more than a silver lining in this campaign, and the Conservatives should be congratulated for doing that. That was not an easy thing to do. But second, Canadians don't punish the Liberals. The more they slap their wrists. They give them 103 seats. They return to Parliament many of the ministers who will be, if they are so inclined, opposition critics who will know far more about those portfolios than the unfortunate new ministers who will have to stand up in the House of Commons every day. Jason, you might be one of them. We hope you are. But who will have to stand up in the Commons today and who are just learning their portfolios, no fault of their own, but they will be up against real attack dogs, I would think, if those former ministers are inclined to do that. And of course, they remain classically a government in waiting. Obviously, that we'll see how long this this Hun Parliament plays out. They revive the New Democratic Party, and they talk about perhaps if you look at our electoral system, the New Democratic Party doesn't increase its popular vote that much, but gets 50% more seats. That left of center alternative is strengthened, and of course in Quebec they diminish slightly the power of the Bloc Québécois. And dampen its triumphalism, and isn't going to stop the sovereigntist train in Quebec, but nonetheless is important. The Liberals, a few other things, voter turnout is up. The Liberals are not decimated. Two national parties emerge, not just one. How much time do I have? I'm over. Okay, all right. Can I just say one word about foreign policy? I'll leave Canadian-American relations to Gordon Giffen. I don't expect major changes in how the Conservatives run foreign policy. I do expect much more emphasis on resources and a lot less on rhetoric. I don't think they're going to launch a foreign policy review. I think they'll be much more pointed and focused in their foreign policy, and I think they'll be interested more in making a difference than making a point. One area that could emerge as interesting is Arctic sovereignty. I'll just stop there.
Well, after those four insightful presentations, you know the old story about being Elizabeth Taylor's eighth husband. I know what I'm supposed to do, but it's hard to figure out how to make it interesting. I'm a living contradiction sitting before you here after listening to Jason's introduction. I'm a Clinton Gore Democrat who sits on the board of a oil and gas company in Canada with the largest oil sands project ongoing in Canada right now, and I'm proud of both. So figure that one out. Jason, I congratulate you and your colleagues in the Conservative Party for doing something that I thought was geographically impossible. You've moved the center of the universe from Toronto to Calgary. So congratulations to you. Also, I have to observe, I didn't know of the comment at Mr. Harper's press conference yesterday about the incumbent U.S. ambassador, but I don't see anything wrong with the government of Canada taking instructions from the U.S. ambassador. I think it's a very good idea. Canada-U.S. relations. I have this vision in my mind. The last time there was a Conservative Prime Minister and a Republican President, they gathered together in the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, put their arms around each other and sang "When Irish Eyes Are Smiling," and that to some epitomized the relationship between our two countries at the time. Now I'm envisioning the Palliser in Calgary with our two leaders with arms around each other singing "Home on the Range." I think it is important to acknowledge in that context that for the first time in roughly, I guess, 18 years, we do have a conservative prime minister coming in Canada while there's a Republican president in the United States, and that is that's a meaningful thing to take note of, and it brings about extraordinarily high expectations among particularly some in Canada and certainly some in our government here in the United States, high expectations about a renewed close relationship between our two countries. I have to observe that if you go back to the period a little over 2 years ago when Mr. Martin took over from Prime Minister Chrétien, if you go back to the press at that time, there were scads of stories about how the new Prime Minister was committed to renewing the relationship with the United States, and it would be a much more mature, much more collaborative relationship with the U.S. I suggest that probably was overstated as to what later transpired in terms of the relationship. So I suggest that the euphoria about an incoming prime minister of whatever party it might be, all of a sudden causing the dynamic between Canada and the United States to be altered in a meaningful way is probably a little extreme. I have to quickly acknowledge that from a political philosophy point of view, there are more similarities, I think, between the incoming administration in Canada and the incumbent administration in the United States. But I have to add quickly that the issues that are joined between Canada and the United States tend not to be subject to a political philosophy. There's not a conservative or liberal view of softwood lumber. There's a Canadian view and an American view on softwood lumber, and I don't think what political party you're in necessarily is immediately going to resolve an issue like that, or Mad Cow, or Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, or anything of the kind. They're not political philosophy. Second, I believe that the Canadian public, maybe unconsciously or maybe literally, put parameters on what any government in Canada can do in terms of relationships with the United States. I've often in the past referred to that as what I think of as the Goldilocks conundrum. You know, it's either too hot or too cold. You never can get it quite right. And the Canadian public, while they may not be, and I don't believe the Canadian public certainly in any material way is anti-American, they are a little arm's length in their philosophy about those of us in the U.S. And that means a Canadian Prime Minister of any party has to walk a pretty fine line about how they engage with us. I got a lot of trite sort of titles that I put things under, but next comes my water in the well theory. And that is, I've always believed that in order to take water out of a well, you have to make sure there's water in it. And successive governments in Canada have followed the theory that there's a bottomless well, that the need to collaborate with the U.S. from time to time is an unfortunate concept and probably politically debilitating in Canada, and therefore the idea is that you just take water out. It is necessary for both sides of the coin here to worry about collaboration, and I think it is important to recognize that a policy of arm's length dealing with the United States makes that kind of collaboration difficult. Next trite subject would be it takes two to tango, and by that I mean the American government has to participate in the collaboration as well. I believe that not just with respect to Canada, but generally, our foreign policy has been somewhat unilateral in recent years, and in order to have a great bilateral relationship with Canada, you have to recognize that by means two. The Canadians don't just have to do it our way, there has to be a collaboration. The tone at the top does matter. Anybody that thinks otherwise, I think, is making a mistake. And by that I mean the relationship between the President and the Prime Minister matters. And any new Prime Minister coming in at a time where there's a sitting President, or vice versa, a new President coming in when there's a sitting Prime Minister, has an opportunity to start over, just by definition, whatever political party you may be in. Prime Minister Martin did, during the campaign, take a few swipes at President Bush, so I have to suspect there's some openness to the idea of working with the fellow who didn't take swipes at him. That is only natural and human. But the development of a chemistry between our two leaders is very important. I hearken back to the time, I don't know if you all remember the speech that President Clinton made in Mont-Tremblant, Quebec on federalism, which was one of my proudest days as U.S. ambassador. I sat there and heard a tour de force by an American president on a geopolitical question that was somewhat relevant in the jurisdiction in which we were sitting. And I can tell you that President Clinton went to Quebec to make that speech for his friend, Jean Chrétien, who happened to be Prime Minister of Canada. He didn't go for the Prime Minister of Canada. And I think it's important to recognize that friendship is important between our two leaders. That doesn't mean, none of us give everything to our friend that our friend asks for, obviously. So I don't mean to suggest it's some sort of capitulation to be friends. But it makes a huge, huge difference, and I've seen it, as they say, up close and personal. The last thing that I'll say is that I firmly believe that we're nibbling around the edges as two countries with whether or not we are prepared to deal with each other in an era of what I'll call new continentalism. We either are prepared to recognize that each modest tactic, if you will, that we argue about, whether it's management of the border, whether it's how lumber transits our continent, how we deal with each other on the environment, Kyoto, or anything of the kind, if we don't put it in those tactics in the context of a consensus strategy of a new continentalism, I think we can't make the little components work. And a new continentalism, in my view, does not mean Canada's less sovereign, that things are to be done the way the United States would suggest that they are done. But it does mean that we have to recognize that there's a European continentalism. My narrow-minded view is that we got sandbagged on Kyoto by a European strategy that was economic-driven, not environmental-driven. And we permitted it to happen in North America because Canada and the United States were not together. Those are the sorts of things that we have to start realizing in this new context. So I'm, as I always have been, unrelated to what government occupies power in Ottawa or Washington, enormously optimistic about how we work together and how we will work together. But I suggest it's vitally important that there be a dialogue in Canada about relations with the United States and about a new, mature, growing continentalism and why that makes sense for Canadians, unrelated to what the United States may want. And there needs to be much more of a dialogue in the United States as well, in our Congress and elsewhere, about what that means for us as a country. So with that, I'll shut up.
Well, thank you very much, John, Jason, John, Andrew, and Gordon. I don't like to take all the thanks for putting this program together. It was truly a collaborative effort with my colleague Scotty Greenwood, who helped put this panel together. We will now turn to questions. We've got some time, and I believe we can go a little bit over if we do have questions. I would ask you to please identify yourself, and since we are webcasting this, would you please use the microphone so the folks can hear the questions? And I would also ask if working media could hold their questions to the end to let other guests have a chance to ask questions. Okay.
Question to Jason Kenney. First, congratulations on your victory, your re-election to Parliament particularly, and the party's victory. The party raised the issue of Canada's place in the world. This was also at a personal interest of Prime Minister Martin. He was instrumental in the creation of the G15, and he tried very hard to create the L15 at the level of the heads of government, which has not yet happened, particularly in Canada's relations with the world beyond the G8, the fast-growing part of the world like China and India. What new initiatives will this government take up? And secondly, on the question of the structure of the cabinet itself, do you think it will be the three-tiered structure of cabinet ministers, ministers of state, and parliamentary secretaries? Thanks.
Sure. First, let me just qualify anything I say. I'm not here speaking ex cathedra on behalf of the Prime Minister designate, but I'll just answer your questions based on what we have said and he has said on the public record. You're right in identifying Canada's place in the world as one of the policy themes of our campaign. In particular, we spent a lot of time in the campaign proposing a refurbishment of our neglected military. There is an emerging policy consensus in Canada, I would say from left to right, that we have for too long neglected our armed forces and their capacity to meet our international obligations and maintain, amongst other things, our aging reputation as a peacekeeper. To its credit, the Liberal government recently began some reinvestment in our military capacity. We proposed a significant additional incremental investment in that respect. That would enable us to be a more active player on the world stage and to meet our obligations. Canada right now spends less than half the NATO average as a percentage of GDP on defense. At the end of our theoretical 5-year mandate, we wouldn't be spending quite the average, but we'd be certainly much more respectable in terms of the defense commitment. We also proposed, this is a counterintuitive thing in our platform that didn't get much coverage or attention, we actually proposed a larger budgetary outlay for foreign aid than the incumbent government. Mr. Martin has made great political, rhetorical emphasis. One of his principal sidekicks is Bono. He certainly tried to generate as much political benefit from that as possible, but there hasn't been a lot of movement in terms of foreign aid. We'd like to increase that. Where we would go on with respect to emerging economies, we were not terribly excited in the past about Paul Martin's G20 initiative, having said that, we obviously think Canada has to be a major player in market access to countries like India, Brazil, the PRC, China. But we'd like to promote, as a general principle, free trade and increase Canadian access to those emerging markets, in part to diminish our almost complete reliance on the United States as an export market. But in terms of political structures, we have not been supportive of G20. And I think one thing you'll likely see, certainly based on our track record, is a greater emphasis on democracy, international norms of democracy in international institutions as being an essential prerequisite for full engagement in international fora. Finally, in terms of the structure of cabinet, I can't really comment on that. All I can say is Mr. Harper has said that he will have a smaller cabinet than which currently exists. In the British system, they actually only have about 8 senior cabinet ministers. You know, the 3 tiers under that. I don't imagine he's looking at something that collapsed, but I suspect it'll be substantially smaller based on what he said publicly than the current cabinet.
My name is Joe Dukert, and as a political economist, I hope I've guessed the answer to the question I'm about to propose. In the United States, at least for the past 50 or 60 years, it has been rare indeed when a new president accepts graciously and enthusiastically an initiative launched by his predecessor of another party. And yet, I think the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which was launched while Paul Martin was a member of the triumvirate of 3 amigos, has mutual benefits for all 3 countries. Struck by the idea that the new Prime Minister might act counterintuitively from time to time, I wonder if various members of the panel would speculate on how enthusiastically Stephen Harper as Prime Minister will support this trilateral initiative, which involves regular meetings among many cabinet ministers of the 3 countries.
I think it'll be supported. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. I don't think that this is an issue which is a counterintuitive issue. It's more likely what we saw yesterday, but I think that that's something which Canadians and any administration would support.
I would add that there will be in opposition a temptation for Liberals, some of them pursuing leadership campaigns, to reach for an emotional tone with regard to the United States that seeks to play against the United States and play against cooperation and play against, I think, some of the positive developments that Ambassador Giffen's talking about. In the main, I believe that there is a sufficiency of elite consensus and a sufficiency of returning heavyweights in the Liberal Party that there won't be any basic questioning of important achievements like that. At the same time, in a minority parliament where there is competition among left of center parties for similarly valued voters, it will be tempting for some entities and some individuals to try to position against Mr. Harper's embrace of that initiative, even though it would have been branded as a continuity in Canadian policy rather than a departure. I think it ought to hold, but there will be some pull that could militate against that, and one hopes it won't get out of control.
Yes, I mean, I agree with John's assessment that there could be on the Liberal side, but it's very interesting, the Liberal leadership campaign that will be emerging. You have everybody on these questions potentially from Michael Ignatieff, who obviously has very clear ideas about foreign policy and security issues in particular, to people who will undoubtedly in the Liberal Party play to the peanut gallery on against any form of further cooperation on defense or security issues. So that will be part of the political dynamic, but we will look at all of these things from a perspective of what's in our national interest.
Good morning. I'm Carolyn Laird from the Senate Republican Policy Committee, but I'm also an Albertan. Kenney has been I've voted for Kenney as long as I've been voting. So this is primarily for Mr. Cohen, but whoever else would like to respond as well. Now that the scandals are still being investigated, the Liberal scandals are still being investigated, and I'm sure there will quite possibly be more as a new government takes hold of the bureaucracy and has fun with that. Do you think the dynamic has changed, though, in terms of how these are going to be looked at and the aftermath of when all of these reports start coming out, because of the fact that the people being investigated are now on the opposite side and now are in the opposition? and that it could possibly be, I was reading on some blogs speculating about this, that if the conservative government really goes and wants to investigate these pretty, for lack of a better phrase, pretty tough, that could be, oh, you're just being bullies now.
Well, the Conservative Party has been out of office for 12 years. I think in that period there was enormous frustration that all oppositions face. I would be very surprised that if the Conservatives had the magnanimity of Lincoln and decided indeed we're not going to investigate this in a minority parliament with a bloc, a New Democratic Party and a Conservative Party, there's little the Liberals can do. I mean, there can be obstructionists to a point if indeed they decide that they want to let these investigations go on. Now, it's not that Stephen Harper, the cabinet, cannot not distance but detach themselves from that. But I think that if you are trying to destroy the brand of the Liberal Party, which as the government I think you would like to do, this is one way to do it, and I would be very surprised if there were not more investigations open. I know in the course of the campaign, and Jason can speak to us, the Prime Minister designate did talk of something like what was it, not a special prosecutor, but something like it. I know there are problems with that in our system, but I would expect committees, parliamentary committees, the work of Parliament, we will see more of this. And bullying, well, I think it's going to be an uncomfortable period for the Liberal Party.
As an American observer, don't let the special prosecutor genie out of the bottle.
I just should hear
never get it back in.
John would have a view on this, I'm sure.
Well, obviously, we have absolutely nothing to hide. We welcome all investigations and cooperate fully as we have before. That said, there's something very interesting that some of the most astute, independent, and academic observers of the functionings of the federal government are starting to flag with increasing alarm. And obviously, this is not something, the kind of thing you're going to talk about in the campaign, where the dynamic was clearly to outbid each other on who would unleash more accountability police on the system in Ottawa. But a couple of years ago, I mean, this has been ongoing. And a couple of years ago, a deputy minister remarked to me in Ottawa, well, we all work for the Auditor General now. That's who we really work for. We pretend to work for the Clerk of the Privy Council and for the Prime Minister and the government today, but really what we do is we make sure that the accountability police can't blow us up. That has been a growing phenomenon inside the federal government for some time. The Martin government, in its response to the sponsorship allegations which were surfaced, and most of them were subsequently proven to be true, heavied up the accountability forces inside the government. Watchdog groups have started to proliferate. Media have started to focus more and more on these sorts of issues, including some unflattering light being shed on the government relations industry. I can talk about that offline with anyone who cared to. The opposition has made an issue out of this. The academic theory on how these things works speaks of a control lobby. Auditors, public servants who are responsible for internal affairs and controls, watchdog groups, investigative reporters, and they're one of the best observers of Canadian politics, a very distinguished academic named Donald Savoy, has spoken about the growth of the control lobby to the point already where Ottawa has become dysfunctional as a result, hence my friend the deputy's remark to me. The Conservatives, of course, have just been elected promising to substantially increase the control lobby. It will be very interesting to see where all this ends up. I think any dispassionate observer of Washington or the major state capitals around the United States would agree that the special prosecutor world, the world of investigative reporting dominating the headlines, the growth of the control lobby has contributed to the dysfunction of the American system. One can only hope that Mr. Harper's wisdom and the astuteness of his studentry of government around the world will cause him to show a little bit of restraint, whatever political advantage there may or may not be, in letting the control lobby completely gridlock Ottawa, because it is perilously close to gridlock in terms of trying to get things done there. It is very, very hard to do already, and is about to probably get a little bit harder for Jason and his colleagues.
Will Amatruda Catholic University. My question is to Mr. Kenney. since you have a background both as a philosophy major and as head of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, could you say a few words about your philosophy of taxation and compare and contrast it for the benefit of the Americans with, say, Grover Norquist on the one hand and, say, Henry Aaron on the other?
Okay.
So there.
Well,
I assume you don't mean Henry Aaron, the baseball player.
No.
15 solution.
I have to say, when I was studying Thomas Aquinas at a Catholic university, I don't recall studying anything with the philosophy of taxation, but
Render unto Caesar.
Render unto Caesar. I would say that, look, the difference is in scope, in the party positions in Canada in terms of the scope and size of government are differences of degree and not of kind. That is to say that there's a pretty broad consensus about a fairly robust size of a place for the state in the Canadian economy. In fact, if you match the Conservative fiscal plan as proposed in this election against the Liberal plan, over the course of 5 years, which was the standard timeline, the difference is about 2%. We would spend 2% less of the federal budget, which would be a fraction of a percent of the gross domestic product. So now, Mr. Martin tried to magnify this into a difference between the Liberal vision of a caring society and Stephen Harper's vision of a fend-for-yourself society. The difference is really, we're talking about 0.5% of GDP, perhaps, in terms of the role of government, the federal government of the Canadian economy. So the difference is, in terms of the practical difference, is very narrow. I would say, though, that Mr. Harper does come from the tradition, as do I, which was more, from the Reform Party tradition, which split off originally from the Progressive Conservative Party because of concern about the growth in the level of taxation and some of the negative effects in our economy in the 1980s under the Mulroney government. And one of the real hallmark of Paul Martin's period as finance minister is that we actually saw for the first time ever, since the Second World War, at least, an absolute decline in the size of the federal government. So I guess what I'm saying is there are no stark differences. Grover Norquist would not be very pleased with our fiscal platform. But from a Canadian social democratic perspective, they characterize it as fend for yourself. So it's in the eye of the beholder.
Good morning. My name is Louis Bélanger. I'm a Canadian. I'm in residence at the School of Advanced International Studies, and I was here at the Woodrow Wilson Center this fall and still attached in some way with the Woodrow Wilson Center. Many of the panelists have said, and I think I agree with them, that one of the most important or surprising event in this campaign was the election of 10 Conservative MPs. But you didn't go a lot of into details, so I would like to ask you 3 questions. Why was so surprising? How do you explain it? And what are the consequences for the future of the strategies of the different parties?
Let me say 3 things. First of all, the polling indicated that 17% of bloc switchers were actually people who didn't necessarily want to be there but wanted to find an alternative other than the Liberals. So that was the loathing factor, and they found it after Mr. Harper went to Quebec and made a speech which was about decentralization and dealing with Quebec's aims. The second thing is that I think that the Mulroney forces in Quebec, often called Blue Thunder from the 1980s, were at work as well. It's kind of hard, and I just say this not as a Quebecer, but kind of hard to distinguish who's on what side of the line at what point in time during election campaigns, especially when you see Mr. Bouchard, who was part of the Mulroney cabinet at one point, and then even the founder of the Bloc, now part of the Liberal Party. So, but nonetheless, I think there were those pieces there. The only thing I'd raise is that comes out of that I didn't mention in the first part is that I think there's another issue that we might see develop over time that we have to be cognizant of. Mr. Harper said yesterday that when asked a direct question about election to the Senate or appointment, that it was something he wanted to pursue as a platform for his party. And what's interesting in all of that is that there could be an emergent opportunity for someone to paint Mr. Harper as a Republican as opposed to a parliamentarian, and a ballot question emerge as to what kind of true Canada you really want to have. And I think that is important to keep in context with the Quebec situation as well, in terms of how decentralized that whole issue is played out. So it didn't really necessarily surprise me that they were able to pick up 10 seats, because after making that speech, he provided the alternative for a place for them to go.
If I could add to that, generally speaking, I'm extremely optimistic about Canada's prospects. The economy is extremely healthy. People are in a pretty decent mood. The one thing that gives me a little bit of concern, and I don't want to overstate this, is that in this very delicate parliamentary situation, Quebec is clearly the next important opportunity for Mr. Harper. He came close to a real breakout in the province where he would have 30 or even 40 seats, and that's very important from a federalist perspective. At the same time, the offering that he made to Quebec in his speech at Laval on December 19th of a fédéralisme d'ouverture is not simply rhetorical. I don't want to get too deeply into the mysteries of fiscal federalism in Canada, because it really will put all of you to sleep and spoil your weekend. But Mr. Harper has promised to rectify something called the fiscal imbalance, whereby the intellect goes. The feds have all the big surpluses and the provinces pay all the big bills for things like healthcare and education. And this is wrong, and it should be fixed. Mr. Harper embraced this issue. In the last campaign, he sort of toyed with it, and in this one, he ran on it. And that was the policy substance behind his overture to Quebec. It played enormously well in Quebec. The fiscal imbalance is a symbol of the sense of deadlock that pervades Quebec society on matters political. It's extraordinarily resonant. Only in Canada could people emote about transfer payments, but that's exactly how it goes in Quebec. The thing that gives one pause is that, or at least gives me and my co-partisans pause, and this is too complicated to have gone through out there in a commercial, is that you look at what the Bloc Québécois and the Parti Québécois have done in the last 2 days, and you can see a worrisome scenario developing. 2 days ago, the Parti Québécois leader André Boisclair, he who is an openly gay politician who is admitted to snorting cocaine, again only in Quebec, and the guy's 30 points ahead in the polls. Boisclair said that he shifted the position of the Parti Québécois, the Sovereignist Party, from being, Harper's making it up, he's just lying to you, to being, okay, show me the money. And he posted a demand of $6 billion over 5 years for Quebec alone. Now that would be 5 times the amount that Mr. Harper has indicated is the upper limit of dollars that he is prepared to transfer. There is not enough oil and gas revenue in all of Alberta, even if we hurt those poor little oil sands who we really have to fight to save. There is not enough revenue to satisfy that demand. The Bloc and the Parti Québécois, the Sovereignist movement, is shifting its strategy, I believe, to try to set up an offer and rejection scenario, which has proven to be the most potent motor for sovereigntist support. Quebec heads towards a provincial election that by tradition will either be in approximately 1 year or in approximately 18 months. It is the most important event that will happen in this 5-year frame in Canada, and Mr. Harper has chosen to involve himself in those dynamics with an offer. I pray that he will show all the wisdom and the good counsel and the deep thought that I know he's capable of in managing this situation. And I also believe it will drive the timing of the federal election. So I'm not being Chicken Little or running a negative ad with a hot typescript here when I say, and I'm certainly not trying to talk down the Canadian prospect, but I believe this is a cloud on the horizon. I hope that it will break up long before it comes over our heads, and I'm confident that it will.
Can I just add to that? John is right to be concerned. Obviously, anybody who knows the numbers in Quebec understands that in the past year, the generic ballot question support for separation has reached sustainable and perceptibly close highs in the mid to high 50s. That, I hope and believe, was in large part a reaction amongst Francophone Quebecers. It was a emblematic way of expressing their disdain with what they regarded as a culture of corruption with the Liberal government in Ottawa. And I hope, and I'm sure that John joins me in this, is that having diffused that issue, the change of federal government, that Quebecers can now turn the temperature down in terms of their general anger at Ottawa. So that's a huge opportunity for us if we meet the very high standard that we've set for ourselves in terms of ethics. And one of the other hopeful signs is that we didn't just elect 10 MPs in Quebec. We elected 10 very good MPs. One of the problems that Brian Mulroney had in 1984 when he unexpectedly swept in with, what was it, 58 MPs, was
a singer, a courier,
was that a good 3/4 of them had no chance, no expectation of winning, and they were MPs by accident. The folks that we've elected are generally very high caliber, and they're either deeply rooted in either the Parti libéral du Québec or l'Action démocratique, which is, for those who aren't aware, there's a third party in Quebec provincial politics, which is it's essentially a small c conservative, small r reform, free market-ish policy. It's outside la pensée unique, le modèle québécois, this kind of social democratic model of the PQ. And we have very strong support. So I would, from the ADQ and from certain elements of the PLQ, and this is very important because yes, Boisclair, the separatists, Monsieur Duceppe in Ottawa in particular, are going to set an unachievable threshold for us to meet in terms of all of Quebec's expectations. But we have the goodwill of both the Premier of Quebec, a former leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, who Mr. Harper consistently talked up during the campaign, and the goodwill of Mario Dumont, the leader of Action démocratique. So in that dynamic, I'm hopeful that we can manage the expectations.
Can I just have a supplementary on that, just before we do that? I mean, if you actually ask people about their polling circumstances and whether they are supporting it, supports Mr. Kenney's position that we've actually got about only 30%, in fact, who are voting for sovereignty, and that the remaining residual, in fact, was voting against the Liberals. So it doesn't seem as far-fetched as, to have a separatist movement as some would suggest. Sorry.
Just if I may add a couple of comments on Louis Bélanger's question. The other part of the offer to Quebec, other than correcting the fiscal imbalance, was Quebec would be able to speak at international conferences. They talked about UNESCO. Mr. Harper seems to have no reservations at all about broadening the role of the provinces, because it wouldn't just be Quebec, it seems to me, in foreign policy. This actually is playing out in this city in a very low-intensity battle right now, which is not being talked about just how much the role the Alberta representative should have here. He's not here now, he was here, and I see Colin Robertson's not here, so I'm safe. But how much, but John talks about perhaps the coming crisis over Quebec. The other crisis that people like me worried about is just how much are you going to devolve to the provinces, and is this offer emblematic of something larger? Because this can be done in ways that the Parliament of Canada may not have a role in. It may be done through executive federalism. So there's that. The other thing is, as Mr. Harper makes gains in Quebec and the Conservative Party makes gains in Quebec, there is an opportunity, but there are also some dangers there. For example, to relate to what we're talking about here, Canadian-American relations, ballistic missile defense. If Mr. Harper really wants to reopen that, as there is some talk, and I don't think he really will, Jason may want to speak to this, let's just say that is not a popular issue in Quebec. And what's interesting is Quebec, which used to be a very pro-American province, has turned quite anti-American. And that's statistically shown. And I think that one of the reasons that Mr. Martin did not go, and John may want to speak to this, did not move on ballistic missile defense a year ago, was worried about how it would play in Quebec. So with that opportunity in Quebec for Mr. Harper comes not just the whole debate over what he might do, but social values and how those may be accepted in Quebec, and other policy choices which, before not having any representation in Quebec, he might have had a more freer hand on.
At the risk of acting like I just want to have something to say, the interesting part of this dynamic to me, getting back to the Canada-U.S. dynamic, is the more the provinces exert their authorities, and the more Canada devolves power and authority, including participation in international dialogues, to the provinces, the more difficult it is to deal with Canada on the international level. I say that as somebody who was quite involved in the softwood lumber talks for years. And one of the things that impeded resolution was that we would reach, in a sense, an understanding in principle about where the compromise answer was. And then the government of Canada would consult 13 different power centers in Canada, and the egg got scrambled again. In order to deal with foreign governments, the government of Canada has to be, and I'm not just talking on great big geopolitical questions, but on bilateral trade negotiations, how you manage the border. With the government of Canada is the interlocutor with the White House. And while the White House has to consult with Congress, if they decide to go forward, they can go forward. They don't have to check with the 50 governors, for example, and that complicates. And the more you imply to the provinces that, we won't do anything without checking with you, it complicates doing deals.
Good morning, Jonathan Moore from Smith & Harrell Public Affairs in Virginia. I have two quick questions. One is, whatever became of Stockwell Day back in the Reform Alliance period? And the other is, do you foresee a greater role for the Atlantic provinces with their conservative premiers?
With respect, Mr. Day was the leader of the opposition leader of one of the precursor parties to the new Conservative Party, the Canadian Alliance. Ended up losing his job in the midst of a internal party feud in 2002 to Stephen Harper, but has, I think, by all accounts, been an extraordinarily loyal and effective member of our party since that time as our spokesman, our critic on foreign affairs, and he, I think, has earned a reputation as a diligent member of our shadow cabinet. With respect to the Atlantic provinces, all four Atlantic provinces are governed by progressive conservative governments. Three of them, Nova Scotia, PEI, and New Brunswick, worked very closely with Mr. Harper in the election campaign, and we didn't quite realize the breakthrough we were hoping in that region, but did respectably well. I think we ended up with about 35% of the vote in Atlantic Canada, and Mr. Harper did lay out some specific proposals for economic development in that region. One of the policy themes of our campaign that was particularly popular in Atlantic Canada was our rebuild of the military. That's the region which is most supportive of our military tradition. So it was an important, in a way, it was an important turnaround because Mr. Harper had once made some comments which he has since admitted were imprudent about Atlantic Canada, Atlantic Canada's economy. And he was able really to turn that around, I think, at an emotional level and on a policy level in this campaign. I think is fairly well regarded there now. So that bodes well for us in the future.
Scotty, and then
Scotty Greenwood. Gentlemen, thank you so much for a terrific discussion. I think we could, some of us Canada-U.S. geeks could probably sit here all day. My question, though, is to Mr. Kenney. Would you like to comment on Ambassador Giffen's characterization of the Canadian political Goldilocks conundrum, where the Prime Minister can't be seen as too close to the United States, can't be seen as too distant from the United States, has to get it just right? I'm wondering what your view of just right is, and what that might have, what impact that might have from a public policy point of view.
Well, I think the most important thing here is that the new government represents an opportunity for a fresh start in the bilateral relationship. Mr. Martin once brought that hope and expectation to his premiership, but it didn't quite work out that well. It didn't work out that way. He promised what he actually implicitly, while running for leader, implicitly criticized Jean Chrétien's, the tone of Jean Chrétien's diplomacy or lack thereof in bilateral relations, and called for a more sophisticated and mature relationship with the United States, one that would, as is the tradition in Canadian politics, assert our national values and interests, but would not be disagreeable when we disagree. Unfortunately, as I say, that promise wasn't realized, and that particularity was that brought into focus when Mr. Martin was, apparently the government was well on the way to negotiating a Canadian role in missile defense when he had the inconvenience of a party policy convention on the horizon. And it became clear that there was going to be a resolution adopted with an overwhelming majority opposing Canadian involvement in missile defense. And so he made a volte-face and ended up, without properly communicating with the administration, pulling out of the negotiations, rejecting any proposal, and doing so in a tone that was not what he was. It was more consistent with Jean Chrétien's tone than the one he had promised. So this is an opportunity for us to set, I think, a different tone. But make no mistake, Mr. Harper is clear. You can look at his remarks yesterday. He is going to vigorously assert Canada's interests in this relationship, particularly with respect to what we regard as, in some respects, illegal American protectionist actions, such as on softwood lumber. But we want to get results. We don't. Mr. Harper has said over and again that on Canada-U.S. relations, the objective is not to generate headlines. It's not to generate phony talking points. It's actually to get results. So I think the tone will be more diplomatic, more, to use Paul Martin's word, more sophisticated, and hopefully that will generate results. One of the hopeful things about this election is that we saw a more explicit appeal to anti-American currents in Canadian public opinion than we've seen since 1988 in the Liberal campaign against free trade, where they implied that it would eliminate Canada's sovereignty. That was a pretty heavy theme in this campaign, and it wasn't successful. I mean, there are some things that the Liberals said about us there that did make things go a little wobbly at the end, but it wasn't on Canada-U.S. And I just want to say one thing about Quebec. It's true that Quebec has become less hospitable to the United States in recent years than it used to be, but that's not universally the case. That's certainly the case in Montreal, but it's not the case in the Beauce or in parts of eastern Quebec, and we won ridings there with 2/3 of the vote. So there is this kind of appeal, this knee-jerk appeal to anti-Americanism didn't work in this election. I think that, again, bodes well for the future of this new government.
I could just briefly offer an observation in this vein from a different perspective, more sort of Pache Speaker Rayburn's comment that all politics is local, and to be a bit more optimistic than I was perhaps in my previous intervention. Many of you are concerned, of course, with the Windsor-Detroit border crossing and the very, very fitful progress towards doing that. We've done a little work in this area, and I'm not telling tales out of school to suggest that one of the things that made it very difficult for the federal government to move as quickly as many would like had to do with very local concerns in Windsor about truck traffic and specifically a stretch of Huron Church Road. I mean, this is getting very Rayburn-esque here. Of course, Windsor is a town that's politically divided between Liberals and New Democrats. It's not a conservative town, probably isn't going to be. I know that they mounted a very good campaign and they expect to win there next time, but that said, it is not in the heartland of conservative Canada. It will therefore be a little bit easier for the overarching question of improving the border connect to be addressed by a conservative government than it might be otherwise the case. I think you're going to see some hopeful developments in a number of areas like that, probably forming more of the substance and by extension the tone of Canada-U.S. relations under this government than overarching philosophies. On overarching philosophies, Mr. Harper has to hit the Goldilocks place. He's got to walk the line, because we are poised with at any time Liberals are poised to do that kind of an attack, and it is very effective actually. So I think in tone and philosophy, the big issues, measured, but considerable progress on some of the smaller ones for reasons of the kind that I've described, as much as out of orientation and philosophy. One hopes to also develop a friendship at the top. He's a likable person, and so I understand is the president. So maybe they'll get along like a house on fire, and we can have a replica of that tremendous speech that President Clinton did for his friend Gordon Giffen at Tremblant, which was one of the most amazing discourses I've ever seen in my life. So
I just want to add to one thing, that because for so many years now we have talked about anti-Americanism. It simply is not the case in Canada. I see absolutely no evidence of it. I have asked not one question, but a battery of questions, and found that there's roughly 13% of Canadians who, in fact, are anti-American in terms of what it stands for, the country, the lifestyle, everything, but 87% are not. What we have in this country, in Canada, is an anti-administration circumstance, which is similar to virtually every other country in the world, last time I checked the polls. So there is an issue there. Secondly, Canadians are an agglomerate of different geographic and groupings of people. It's pretty hard for me to say that Americans support this or that when half the public, in fact, doesn't on a particular policy issue. Consider our country. We're in this election campaign, 35% throw their vote to one party, 38 to another, 21 to another. I mean, you're all over the place. So I think it's really important to keep in mind for our American friends that really Canada, as Canadians, doesn't speak necessarily with one voice. They might with a certain sentiment, but not with a one voice. There are a lot of tongues across the country and a lot of different views, and you have to take that into consideration too.
Okay, we've kept you long. I'll have one quick question here, and then we'll close.
Steve Zimmerman with the law firm Dyke & McGossett. The Institute had a similar kind of panel following the previous federal election when the Liberal Party was in the minority with Paul Martin. And during that presentation, a couple of observations were made as to the potential for some major policy initiatives that might take place with a minority government, as was stated, did occur on occasion with previous minority governments. I have not heard that today. Is it because there are no major policy initiatives to consider, or is it, as John Duffy says, it's too delicate of a parliamentary situation?
Well, Ambassador Giffen alluded to what some of the Canada-U.S. junkies have been writing about and talking about, of a broader continental agenda in terms of security and the economy. But I don't think there's an appetite in either side in official government circles to pursue a kind of omnibus strategy, but rather to work out problems on an issue-by-issue basis. And that has been what we proposed in opposition, a kind of practical, results-oriented approach to bilateral relations. And I haven't observed any appetite in Washington for any kind of grander scheme than that.
I was part of the last panel, and I recall what was said about that, and we're about policy initiatives and putting a face on the new government. There were at least 5 things mentioned yesterday, including at the press conference the election of a senator at some point. They may seem very simple, but they are actually pretty big initiatives in terms of their complexity. Childcare is the difference between $1,200 being handed out to parents in the national child care system, the debate that took place during the campaign. Fiscal imbalance is really a discussion about decentralization and many of the things that go with that. The GST, there's probably not as much an issue on, and there's a couple of others that are, could be problematic. So I'm not really sure that there's one big initiative, but there's enough there that in the 5 or 6 that the Tories may want to bring forward, they could be turned into something. The only question is whether or not the Liberals are up to the job of dealing with it, because of a party which is pretty well spent at the moment and engaged in their own internal leadership debates. So it may fall on Jack Layton from the NDP to debate many of those points.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I thought the question was about bilateral, not domestic policy. I apologize.
First of all, it's good to see you, and there's a distinctly Michigan kind of feel happening here, and go Wolverines, I can only say. The Parliament, the initiatives that Mr. Harper is proposing, while they have been presented as somewhat quotidian, the Liberal campaign labored mightily and in the end unsuccessfully to portray them as being what we believe are very large initiatives. With a thin mandate, as the Conservatives have received, with a Parliament stacked 3-2 against them from the parties of the centre-left, with the committee system therefore being absolutely dominated by parties of the centre-left, progress on these will be fitful where they cannot be implemented directly through the executive branch. I think at the same time what all opposition parties are going to be careful of is setting up a scenario where Mr. Harper could run against Parliament and run against the minority, much as Harry Truman ran against the Do-Nothing Congress. If things are thrown into complete gridlock, one imagines a scenario where opposition parties could be punished in an election triggered by Mr. Harper in pursuit of that scenario. These are big changes. On tax policy, the GST is large. It's not an easy pass-through because it entails rolling back an already implemented, on workers' paychecks, liberal cut to the personal income tax. And there are different sets of benefits distributed around about society on those things. So that's not just going to go through because it's not as though Mr. Harper's won so sweeping a mandate that he can sort of come in as President Reagan did in 1980 and say, look, I control both houses of Congress, I've had a revolution, I got a huge mandate, everybody loves me, everybody's got to get in line. We're not in that situation at all. And so implementation of some of these platform elements could be difficult. At the same time, it was pretty clear to those of us on our side analyzing the Conservative platform that Mr. Harper had designed his platform with implementation in a minority parliament very much in mind. I think it's probably fair to say that Mr. Harper will be the most strategically shrewd person in the Prime Minister's chair, among the most strategically shrewd persons in the Prime Minister's chair in the history of the country. He is an intellectual in action and a very strategic guy. And so he's usually seen his way around a few corners ahead of the rest of us. I know he did around some corners that my party hadn't seen around, and that's why he's Prime Minister today.
At the risk of sounding like I'm dwelling on storybook characters and moving from Goldilocks to Pollyanna, I want to make one last pitch for a more strategic design in dealing with the United States. I think if you take the things that we talk about across our common border and aggregate them, they require a more strategic approach as opposed to an issue-by-issue approach. If there are people all across the border, particularly in southern Ontario and Quebec, that don't want some sort of impediment in the way of a formalized document to being able to travel across the border to go shopping or to go skiing or whatever it might be, and that's the same with Americans. There are people in the West that don't want impediments to shipping beef across the border or impediments to shipping lumber across the border. The argument against the free trade agreement and NAFTA was, well, we can do it sector by sector. We don't need some broad framework in which to fit all of these things. And I suggest we have to dare to succeed together and challenge the small think that we should always do it on a one-off basis, because the next big step together not only is how we coexist across the 49th parallel, but how we deal with Europe and Asia. There are some things that should be continental in their approach, and thereby benefit both our citizenry enormously more.
Okay, we want to thank everybody for coming. We hope this has been enjoyable. I've certainly found it helpful, enlightening, educational, even entertaining. And we'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for being here, and we hope forward to seeing them in the future. The Woodrow Wilson Center, our partners, thank you for coming, and we're adjourned.
I'm not convinced. My mind is open on it and whether it'll happen. I just need to go to Washington really quickly.
So I don't know her lunch list. And she is with General Counsel to
UPS, United Press.
They have a long-standing issue with her. I know it from my days.
Delegations from all over the government on security and partnership. And it was very productive. And they're looking to come up with more about how to work together.
Excellent. Which is exactly the right way to deal with it.
And it was great. I attended on behalf of the council, but they brought in a few private sectors.
Yeah.
And then each of the governors had, have you read The World is Flat by Tom?
Yes, yes.
It's right out of his book, right? The whole, we took a midnight tour of their World Port facility,
Yes, yes.
Planes landing and taking off. It was really cool.
Yeah.
But anyway, they're really trying to be good corporate citizens and help the policy out.
Well, that's excellent. Yeah, no, exactly. So, what are your big plans, or your organization's big plans?
For this year?
Yeah.
We think it's important actually to take the frame of reference to Canada-U.S. relationship away from London, although we're
Tell me about it. Yeah.
and frame it maybe in terms of something like interfere, which is very popular and important here. And Canada is the solution to energy security, right? So we're working hard on issues like that this year. We're worried about border infrastructure. We are worried about the customers and travel. So those are the things we're working on.
Yeah, I think you'll get a lot of resonance on border infrastructure. I think you'll get, because I know that everybody's getting that solved and done right. The travel initiative, yes, it's important. And that you need. Yeah, but it's interesting because it struck me that the 60 minutes had this. I saw it. All this energy they're waiting to be had. What do they want to sell? The same way I use the that's okay. But it was an interesting hearing. Hello. Yes, I am. Thank you.
For a Canadian.
For a Canadian.
You're actually well dressed and well spoken. No. That period full stop. And you look so nice.
That's all right. Just excuse me a second to see Eddie and that I haven't seen so many in one room. Well, there you go. I I'm at the moment doing a visiting fellowship at the Kenney School. I'm running. Ah, excellent. Thank you. I'm from the Government of Canada, and I if I can find my business cards here. Did you have a card? Yes, I do. Well, I will give you one. All right. Okay. Yes.
Okay, I saw that.
Yes. And where are you located? I'm just visiting here. I'm just visiting here. Yes, I'm in Ottawa. So the address is on the flip side. Right up there. See if I can talk to Ambassador Giffen for a minute. Who's that other guy in red tie?
Yeah, that's right. Great to see you. I'm out in Calgary. Great to see you. So when are you off? It was mainly
Well, I think so. This is where we're going to find out.
Yeah, I admire you for doing this because you see, in your case, it's harder than most. You had a personal it wasn't just you being an apparatus, and I you know,
But you got to
one feels for you, you know.
Side.
Heaven knows what those guys would pick up. I think everybody was fairly Canadian in their generosity today. I mean, nobody, not filibustering over Elliot. So,
I guess probably just as a safe place.
Probably.
Do you think that the challenge of this issue, if I can help them with them not being treated as I just think
and this is the reason that
there's no appetite here.
And yet, within the institution, there's no appetite to institutionalize, formalize,
Yeah, we can get our everybody leaves.
how can they afford to have less a small percentage of the answer I was given was, well, they'll cover less and the soldiers they don't have
express their view. That's one question on American sovereignty. You can't actually showdown between a icebreaker and
that last
Look, the first thing is what's going on. I'm a polarized captain through the Northwest Passage, and we have to know what's going on.
Yeah. You can't start down here and get it.
I'll talk to you
Soldiers by the Northwest Passage. Thank you very much. Right now, the Liberal government doesn't appear to know which foreign investors, naval investors are going into our territorial waters. Mr. Harper applies to change reference, so at least we'll have protection capacity to know who's going around up there.
So they have to ask permission.
Any foreign government should ask permission for going to our territorial waters. And take them seriously. Our approach to sovereignty is that we have access to.
Now that we're the lead directors,
Electronic surveillance. We need to know it's not just the Americans, it's other navies, vessels in waters. We need to be there. We're serious about setting up like 100. We can't just take it back. All right, but it's by the way, I was in the scrum of